Welcome everyone to Insights number 10. And the title of this slide, LSAT GPT, is just a play on ChatGPT, which most of you, if not all of you, should know is kind of the premier leading, human-sounding AI that's kind of going all around the internet these days. And so I'll get into why I'm talking about it here on the next slide. So why? Why this subject today? While most inquiries that I get are unsurprisingly about how to do better on the exam, I have seen a slight uptick in people asking me for my thoughts on generative AI versus the LSAT. That is something that people have been pitting ChatGPT specifically, but just AI in general, against various professional exams and professional tasks, and been getting mixed results. And so I do want to emphasize that for those of you studying for this exam, it's not the issue of AI and what it does is not as irrelevant as it might initially appear. So when it comes to this exam, the folks at LSAT Labs actually fed an LSAT to ChatGPT, which is again, like I said, pretty much the leading AI bot, and it scored a 148, which is of course not a very good score, right? It failed LG of all things. You can search for the results on the LSAT subreddit. I think it was about 5 months ago that they did this for much greater detail and nuance on precisely what it did and how it did. When it comes to law school, the next step in our careers really, apparently ChatGPT can pass, a semester's worth of classes. I think they did it basically four, 1L courses with a C plus, but it was noticeably inferior than human students at answering open-ended prompts. And that's a problem because open-ended prompts are pretty much the mainstay of most 1L and 2L courses that I can properly remember. And so for more information, they did test this at the University of Minnesota Law School, so look them up and ChatGPT if you so desire. Finally, when it comes to legal practice, ChatGPT has made an appearance in legal practice, but it was not a very good one. It's disastrous to say the least. Again, rather than spend too much more time on what is really a tangent, just basically don't do it. And Google it if you want to. I believe the channel on the internet, Legal Eagle, who I would suggest a lot of you guys follow because he's a pretty engaging guy and talks about stuff that ultimately we should be interested in as attorneys. Um, yeah, it wasn't good. It wasn't good. So more relevantly to all of you guys. So yeah, AI is happening, ChatGPT is happening. What can we learn for the exam for all of this? So we'll be focusing on generative AI, specifically ChatGPT, as it relates to actually taking the LSAT, and not so much how to cheat the exam with ChatGPT. That's not what we're doing here. You get a sub median score anyways, that 148, at least until someone trains it to do LG. So no, this isn't about how to use ChatGPT itself on the exam, but we'll talk a little bit more about how ChatGPT actually operates and how that sort of parallels what a lot of the things that I actually suggest that you do. So yeah, as I was saying, instead of again talking about how to actually use this specific program on the exam, which you are not allowed to do, don't even think about it. There's an interesting parallel between how the chatbot works, how ChatGPT works, and how we deal with words we don't know. And we do run into a decent amount of this stuff, even if it's not specific words, phrases, ideas, whatever, things that we do not know on the exam. So overall, I think we can actually adopt some of the things that ChatGPT does, excuse me, while keeping our normal human thought patterns in all the other areas that it works out better. So just a real basic discussion of how ChatGPT works. Um, I suggest if you want to actually learn a little bit more and much more in-depth and entertaining discussion of how ChatGPT works, I highly recommend a video that I'm going to link in the upper right corner from a content creator named Kyle Hill. Some of you might already know who he is. He's got a pretty big channel. And it's called ChatGPT Explained Completely. And he does a pretty good job, I would say, of explaining how the thing actually works. But for our purposes, in a gross oversimplification, I'll just explain it this way. Every single word in the English language is assigned some sort of number in the ChatGPT system. And this database of numbers is fed into ChatGPT. And then on top of that, an absolutely enormous volume of written work, pretty much from the internet, is also fed to ChatGPT, which figures out, hey, 99% of the time, the correct human response to phrase 198,983 space 17428 is word 50051. So it's not actually doing the word thing that we do. It's actually just a giant math formula. So with a large enough set of data to teach ChatGPT what humans say and what humans expect in response, it's possible through the raw power of massive statistical analysis for ChatGPT to learn how to produce output that sounds remarkably human. So again, you feed it words, ChatGPT turns those words into numbers, and then once it's in number format, it knows, okay, I have this set of numbers. Whenever I've seen this set of numbers, this other set of numbers tends to be what human beings want to hear in response. And so ChatGPT does that, and that's why it has sounds remarkably human in a lot of contexts. And here's the issue. We don't really do language like that, right? Um, ChatGPT doesn't actually know what it's saying. Again, it's taking words and not really understanding what the words are, but just assigning them a number, and that number is based simply on the word itself, not what it means, not anything else. It's just this word gets this number, that's it. So it doesn't actually apply any meaning to a word necessarily. And like I've been saying, it's all just a big old statistical analysis. It doesn't know what the phrase, the LSAT is a pain, actually means. It just knows that an acceptable response with that collection of words is, yes, it sucks, based on the amount of times that that sort of call and response has been fed into its database. So we as humans don't exactly do that, right? Instead of assigning each word numerical labels, we assign each word even more, simpler words as definitions, right? And then if we really truly understand a word, it's less about the actual wordy definition that we give them, and it's more about those less tangible concepts, perceptions, memories, etc. to them. So, like for instance, when I say the word father, I know I can describe on a sort of quasi computer level the definition of father, right? Is somebody who has participated in the reproduction of human and blah blah. And there's all sorts of other labels that we can give to the word father, right? But also the thing that pops into my head is my own dad's silly face, right? And dad jokes and all these other associated concepts that are not really as flat and shallow as like a word or a number label. So there's a lot of there's a lot more depth to what our understanding of language is versus what ChatGPT's understanding of language is. So it sounds different than what the computer's doing. But you know, arguably we kind of do the same thing that ChatGPT does, just with a more arguably diverse set of data. And so I just want to emphasize here that my opinion here is not scientific, nor is it based on any formal linguistics training. These are strictly my personal observations. Really, when it comes down to it, if we could find some way to feed ChatGPT the kinds of richer data that I just talked about, these memories, these other associations that have to do with more than just words, images is an easy one, right? And there are chat programs and AI bots that do work with images. Um, it's possible to create a more even more human sounding AI that really does contain the kind of knowledge that we apply to language. So to me, it's really just a matter of technology. There is going to come a time if we keep up with it, if it turns out to be worth it, where if we can find some way to squish down the data that I talked about, the richer sort of definition and understanding words that human beings have, we can probably it's probably going to take a very long time, if ever, to actually truly match the human intellect when it comes to just language. But we can get a lot closer than we are, I believe. But more than the future and all those hypothetical things, what really matters for our discussion here is the really interesting thing for us is how we handle vocabulary that we don't know on the exam and make accurate basis guessed on context, because that to me does mimic a lot of what ChatGPT is trying to do. So this should really sound familiar, this guessing at words via context. When it comes to RC, right? It happens all the time. There's some word that we don't know or some concept. So to figure out at least approximately what it means, we look around that word for context. So we look at words, phrases, and sentences that we do understand, which surround that word that we don't understand. And then based on how we know English works and how those understandable words, phrases, sentences work in other contexts, we, with usually a fairly impressive degree of accuracy, predict that those words that we do know work similarly in this context around this other unknown word. So basically, to make it simpler, what we are doing is we are falling back on our existing knowledge database of how language works and trying to use that to predict that, okay, it's probably going to do a similar or same thing here. So let's see if we can take our previous knowledge and use it to guess at this, heretofore unknown and unforeseen thing that we're looking at. So in other words, like ChatGPT, when we're guessing via context, we don't actually know what that mystery word means exactly. We are merely predicting an accurate usage of it based on patterns we've seen elsewhere. So this works. This really does work great on RC, I think. So as you might imagine, this approach works pretty well on RC, as I was just saying, and it's absolutely no surprise to me that ChatGPT actually performed best on this section. I think it performed best on RC, pretty, I think, okay-ish on LR, and then it just bombed LG apparently. So beyond merely dealing with unfamiliar words, I'm already encouraging you guys in my other content to get a little bit prejudiced and rely on your previous experience of RC when it comes to passages. So again, just it's not just about understanding words that are new to you. The overall dismissive, hostile oversimplification that I advocate on RC relies heavily on a sense of, we've seen this BS before. So, like an example, this is one that you guys have seen multiple times probably already if you've practiced any amount of RC. The author introduces critics. So they did that. Okay, they did that in paragraph one. There's a bunch of stuff we can guess and say about the passage already, knowing nothing other than this generic idea that the author introduced critics. Um, and it turns out, oh, hey, surprise, surprise, those critics mischaracterized the work of this obscure artist, just as I thought, like 99% of what all the other art passages tend to do. And so the author of our passage is probably going to say at some point, the critics think artist X conforms to some Western European centric genre Y, but artist X should actually be seen as working from an indigenous genre Z. And so you can already probably think of a number of passages that do this. The one that comes to mind is I forget which prep test it is, but the talk story one, Maxine Hong Kingston, that's kind of a poster child from a relatively recent exam that does this exact thing. And there's plenty. The domestic novel used to be a favorite genre for them to pick on for this back in older exams, like the 50s and 40s. But yeah, I'm preaching the choir. I know you guys have seen this before. So another example of how to use this sort of fall back on previous patterns to guess at what this one is. The predictive reading thing that I do in general. The first sentence of paragraph one, for example, says that there are two important approaches to some aspect or area of law. And the first sentence of paragraph two says the first such approach is blank. That probably means that paragraph three is probably going to be devoted to covering the second approach. Bonus points if you notice that paragraph two is fairly short and the author merely suggests there are some problems with this first approach. Chances are, if that's the scenario, maybe the author is going to tell us that the second approach would be better. More bonus points if you notice that paragraph 3 says the second approach also has problems. Then there's a good chance the author will suggest maybe a compromise or a third approach is superior, or, you know, there's any number of possibilities, but we kind of see that there's only a certain number of ways it could probably play out. Yet more bonus points if the author surprisingly doesn't suggest a compromise or alternative. This gives us a lot of hints about how we are supposed to characterize the passage when it comes to questions and answer choices later on. Maybe the author, rather than making a recommendation or suggestion, maybe the way to properly characterize the passage is that the author is merely interested in pointing out issues. It doesn't advocate a solution, and is maybe just more interested in explaining the status quo instead of working to change it somehow. So so yeah, I mean, you can update your approach based on how things progress, but basically this is all guesswork. Notice that this could cover any number of passages that we've seen. And even though I decided to use the example of a law passage, this could be done in art, it could be done in any of the other social sciences passages, it could be done in the humanities. There's this could be any generic passage. This is just overall a pattern, or maybe just a particular application of several different patterns that I've seen over my fairly vast RC experience. I've seen this stuff play out any number of ways, and over time, I've just built up a database where like, okay, I've seen this before. This is probably what's going to happen. This is probably what's going to happen. This is probably what's going to happen in a cascade. So while we talked about how that works in RC, I would agree that this does feel a bit iffy for LR. There just seem to be more patterns to keep track of in LR, which is exactly why all those fancy techniques that you spend a lot of time amassing for LR tend to fail you because we have issues of, I think, data recall when it comes to just the massive amount of patterns that you can arguably find. It's hard to memorize all the various language patterns, not like the logical patterns in terms of necessity, sufficiency, and a few of the other things, or and necessary assumptions and that kind of thing. That's not there are not too many of those, but it's really the language patterns that are going to get you, I think. And so not only is language just broadly difficult, there's a lot of variety within that for LR. So within each question type, among the different answer choices. And on top of that, you have to deal with all of that under time pressure and the constant never-ending reset that each LR argument or LR stimulus presents. So contrary to RC, where we can do our sort of ChatGPT AI bot prejudice thing where we see how it's written and we can make a whole ton of good guesses about what the LSAC cares about, what kinds of questions are going to be asked, and all sorts of predictive things, right? We can do that for RC and have apply that to one passage and have it pay off on anywhere from like 6 to 8 questions, 5 to 8 questions, right? LR, we're not so lucky. If we've got 26 LR questions, welcome to 26 different scenarios, right? You're resetting each and every time. So there's a lot less cascading benefit to having this prejudice in place that, these prejudicial shortcuts, right? So this, and of course, even with that considered, it doesn't even get into all those times the LCC decides to cheat its logical standards, as if language wasn't difficult enough. They're also cheating logical standards, which is par for the course on difficult LR questions. There are plenty of times, especially for necessary assumption questions, which are, like I said, ground zero for the LSAC, just signaling you that they want to cheat. There are plenty of times where you come very, very dangerously close to violating the golden rule of LR, which is one of them at least, which is to not question premises, right? That is technically correct. You should never really question a premise directly. But there are so many ways the LSAC has creatively found to get you really, really close to it and then get you an answer choice that actually arguably does just precisely that, questioning a premise, but it happens to be correct. So it's, there are so many examples of this, and it's mostly achieved through language variability. And yeah, and that makes this even harder. That makes this even harder. So that said, there are still a number of handy patterns you can keep track of. And in fact, the majority of my LR work with students is to listen carefully to what they're saying and identify only those few patterns that really seem to lead them to wrong answers. So a lot of people are good enough, who at least my students being something of a self-selecting group, are good enough at the moderate to, the lower end of the toughest questions, right? That they can more or less figure them out intuitively without too much technical work. That you just know how to do them. It's just a few patterns for whatever reason that each individual student tends to miss. For instance, I recently just had a student who was highly skilled at LR. It's just that there is one particular thing. Like he had been trained essentially to ignore certain patterns, like the parts versus whole thing. He just kind of he sees it, but he never really saw it as a prime candidate for a correct answer. And so finding ways for him to incorporate that back into the realm of possibility is just what we were doing. And others of you, maybe you're fine with parts versus whole, but there's other sorts of patterns that um, you don't really see or you dismiss too easily. Whatever it is, this is a highly case by case thing I found. But yeah, it turns out that I usually don't have to teach people a wide variety of patterns. I just have to focus on the few that actually still hold people back. So yeah, then if we've only have a few patterns, we just focus on those few patterns rather than, like I've been saying, insisting on a broad-based, here are all the LR things you need to know. Um, that often does more harm than good. And finally, when it comes to LG, currently, I don't really see how anything that we do in the AI world is really going to be that useful for us. The good news is most of you are pretty good at learning LG as a human being anyway, and you don't really even need to consider fancy AI-based pattern identification behaviors at all here. And this is not to say that there's absolutely no pattern identifications. Yes, obviously, we know that there are four game types, and we can recognize certain kinds of wording when it comes to the intro paragraph and the rules and all that stuff. Yeah, there are some patterns, but it doesn't really cut nearly as deeply to the bottom of the issue, I think, as just it's less about the patterns and more about processing for me. And so, on that note, what most students really need is just an orderly and methodical approach to execute that process. And this, orderly and methodical approach, what does that mean? Well, it's along the lines of always having an answer to the what do I do next question. Just having that seems to be more than enough for people. And so that brings us to the end. Hopefully, the runtime of this one remains short. Um, the big takeaways are AR is currently pretty mediocre, arguably even worse than mediocre at the LSAT and law school, and it's dangerously unfit for legal practice. Again, that's another huge conversation to have, but basically, the moral of the story is don't do it, it's stupid. Uh, the pattern recognition mindset that underpins ChatGPT, though, it is actually parallel in a lot of ways to how I recommend that you do RC. The same, pattern recognition that we just talked about is a bit harder to make useful in LR, in my opinion. And given how learnable LG is, in just normal human methods and how awful, in contrast, ChatGPT is currently at it. It's not really even really thinking about for this. And that's it. That's it. So yeah, this was a short one that I just put together because I got admittedly a single digit number of emails, but that was a lot more than I'd seen ever about this subject. And just because I do think it has relevance to LR, I decided to give you a video. But again, thanks for being here. All the usual algorithm stuff. Feel free to reach out if you have further questions. I'd be happy to entertain them. And I'll see you guys in the next one.